We are fun and inclusive. We are spiritual people, full of excellence and passion. Kingsborough Family.
So I want to take some time this morning to talk about 3 biblical relationology principles. And the first person I want to look at is the person of Joseph. Joseph is one of my favourite Bible characters. My eldest son is 11. He's called Joseph. And when I look at the life of Joseph and his relationships, I see what I call the self-perspective principle. The self-perspective principle. You see, Joseph was the son of Jacob. They lived in Canaan. His father was a shepherd. He had 12 sons, and one of them was Joseph. And his father favoured Joseph. He favoured him as the youngest son. And so, understandably, his siblings hated him. And then his father, Jacob, gave him an ornate robe. Clearly the other sons did not have the same quality of robe. And guess what? His siblings hated him all the more. And then Joseph had some dreams. He had some dreams that his brothers were like corn in the field that would bow down to him. Do you think that did anything for family relations? I think not. And then he had another dream. And he dreamed that there were 11 stars in the sky. And the 11 stars would bow down to him. Do you think this filled his siblings with love or hate? Filled them with hate. And then one day, they plotted to kill Joseph. Thanks to Reuben. My youngest son is Reuben. Thanks to Reuben. I've got a girl in the middle, but my youngest son is Reuben. They left him in a cistern, and he was sold into slavery. Two chapters on, Genesis 37, 2 chapters on, Genesis 39. Joseph finds himself in a different place. He is in Egypt, and he is in Potiphar's house. And the Bible tells us that Joseph was successful in whatever he did. And he found favour in the eyes of Potiphar. And he put him in charge of his whole household. And we know what happens next. His wife had a bit of a crush on him, accused him. He ended up in prison. But what happened in prison? In prison, Joseph found favour. He found success. Even in prison, he was put in charge of the other prisoners. As I read the early years of Joseph's life, I'm struck by what I call the self-perception principle. You see, as a young man, favoured by his father, despised by his brothers, hated because of the robe, and then absolutely hated because of these grandiose schemes, Joseph had a self-perception problem. Because of the grand ideas he had about himself, the ability that he had to build relationships with his siblings and others was diminished. And so I always say Joseph started off with a big head. But through the experiences of life, God gave him a big heart. And in Potiphar's house and in the prison, he was favoured and made successful. And so the self-perception principle states that self-importance diminishes our ability to build relationships. Let me say that again. Self-importance diminishes our ability to build relationships. But self-effacement increases our ability to build relationships. Let me put it another way. Arrogance diminishes people's desire to have a relationship with us. But humility increases people's desire to have a relationship with us. This is the self-perception principle. And I want to ask you this morning, what is your self-perception? Do you think, like in Genesis chapter 37, more highly of yourself than you should? Or do you, like in Joseph in chapter 39, think appropriately about yourself? Are you filled with self-importance, or are you self-effacing and humble? Because the thing that impacts your ability to build relationships with other people begins with your self-perception of yourself. So what is your self-perception of yourself? The second principle I wanted to talk about this morning is from the life of Jesus. And there are many principles I could draw from his life. But the principle I want to draw from the life of Jesus is what I call the differentiated relationships principle. Differentiated relationships principle. Because Jesus not only taught, but he modelled what he taught. And what he taught and what he modelled was a love for God. He modelled and taught a love for the world, for your neighbour, even for your enemy. He loved everybody. In fact, if he ever had a bias, it was a bias to love the downtrodden and not the religious. Just linking my 2 points here, because the religious are filled with self-importance. And the downtrodden are full of humility. But Jesus, whilst his life and his teaching was based upon love for all, he had favourites. He did. Because loving and having favourites are actually compatible. Well, at least according to the life of Jesus. Because Jesus talked, or what should I say this? That one of the gospel writers talked about the beloved disciple. In the Gospel of John, on 6 occasions, the writer wrote about the disciple that Jesus loved. The disciple that Jesus loved was referenced on a number of occasions. At the Last Supper, the disciple who Jesus loved reclined with Jesus and talked with him. At Jesus' crucifixion, the disciple who Jesus loved stood with his mother and looked on as Jesus was crucified and spoke to them. Jesus had a favourite. I wonder, because Matthew, Mark and Luke omit to mention the beloved disciple, but John mentions him 6 times, I wonder if that gives us an indication on who the beloved disciple was. Could it possibly have been John? But you see, Jesus also not only had a favourite, he had a favourite 3. Because Peter, James and John went with Jesus. They were with him in special moments. When he was transfigured in all his glory, who was with him? Peter, James and John. When Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane crying out to his Father, is there any other way than going to the cross and giving my life? Who was there in the background? Peter, James and John. Jesus had favourites. He had the 12, those 12 disciples who he called to follow him, selected from the crowds. And then there were the women who supported the ministry of Jesus and who supported the ministry of the disciples. And then there was the 72 that Jesus sent out in mission in pairs, but he sent out in mission. And then there were the thousands that gathered to listen to Jesus' teaching. You see, Jesus' life demonstrates to us that loving everybody and having favourites is completely compatible, because the differentiated relationship principle states that we cannot have the same relationship with everybody you know. It's not possible. You don't have the time and the energy and resources to give exactly the same to everyone you know. We have to filter our relationships, and we have to manage our energy and our time and our resources to give to people. That doesn't mean we don't love everybody, but just the limitations of who we are means that we have to differentiate our relationships. One of the most common questions I'm asked in seminars is, Matt, how do I keep in contact with everybody I know? Well, thanks to social media, we can keep in contact with everybody we know. And just so I can keep in contact with you, any Twitter people here? Any people on Twitter? Okay, my Twitter handle is @1MattBird. Clearly there's not one Matt Bird, otherwise I wouldn't need to say one, but the other Matt Bird got there first, but I'm @1MattBird. So keep in touch. And now 95% of you heard that will do nothing with it. 5% of you will, because 95% of us are reactive and passive, and only 5% are active. So I'm not going to be inundated, but I'll know who the initiators are and the proactive people are in relationships. But you see, we cannot have the same relationship with everybody we know. We need to be able to manage, just as Jesus did, our relationships. We cannot give ourselves fully to everybody we know, but we can love everybody we know. We can't be friends with everybody, but we can be friendly with everybody. There is no excuse and no reason to snub people, to cut people out. But there is a need to manage our personal resources in our relationships. I'm going to move on in a moment, and perhaps to the third and I think perhaps the most profound of the principles I wanted to cover this morning. But just before I do, if you like this stuff, if you like these principles, every week I write a thought piece about relationships. I call it a blog. I call it a relationology tip. And I email it to everybody who lets me know they want to receive it. So there's a slide that's going to pop up. Ping! As if by magic. If you would like to get a weekly thought from me about relationology principles, please email me at that address right now. Just quickly get your smartphone out, send me a quick email. If you're not on a smartphone, never mind. Write it on there's this thing we used to use called paper and pens. See if you can find a bit of paper and a pen, write the email address out and ping me an email later. And I will send you each week a principle to inspire you about relationships. And I'll also send you a free ebook. I write an ebook 3 times a year, and the latest ebook I will send you as a gift if you want to sign up. So if you're liking this, please email me and we'll keep in contact. The third person I wanted to focus on this morning, and the third principle. The third person is Paul. And for me, he epitomizes what I call the trust transfer principle. The trust transfer principle. You see, Saul, as he was initially known. Can I just get that water, Tunde? It's the water. Thanks. Saul, as he was initially known, he was there at the stoning of Stephen, the first martyr of the Christian church. And Saul was there, and he looked after the robes while others picked up stones to stone Stephen. Saul went about destroying the church. He imprisoned believers. And it says of Saul that he breathed out murderous threats to the believers. So we know he met Jesus on the Damascus Road, and his life was literally turned around. But not everybody knew that he'd met Jesus on the Damascus Road. And so when he began talking about Jesus, not everybody trusted him. How could you trust somebody who had been persecuting the church, putting believers in prison, and breathing out murderous threats? You can imagine that the believers were slightly cautious. Would you be slightly cautious? It's natural and understandable. But what happened, you see, was Barnabas, the son of encouragement, he took Saul and he lent his credibility to him. And in Jerusalem, he took him to the apostles. And he said, he's okay. He's one of us. He has met Jesus Christ of Nazareth. You can imagine the conversation. But there was this lending of credibility from Barnabas to Saul in the eyes of the apostles, the early apostles in Jerusalem. And then later on, that was Acts chapter 9 and a few bits before, but Acts chapter 16, Paul, as he has become called, then goes to a place on his missionary journey called Lystra. And it says, speaking about a guy called Timothy, it said the believers spoke well of him. And when the believers spoke well of Timothy, Paul took him in and created an opportunity for Timothy to join him in his mission. And Paul became his mentor and Timothy became his mentee. But it happened because the believers spoke well of Timothy. They lent their credibility to him. And so the principle of trust transfer states that life opportunities are created by people who are willing to lend their credibility to others. The trust transfer principle says that life opportunities are created by those who are willing to lend their credibility to others. Now, as I look back through my life, all the most significant things that have ever happened to me have been as a result of trust transfer, of someone who took a risk with me to create an opportunity for me. I remember when I was in school, I was planning to leave school straight away. I did not do well at school. School does not define our future, thankfully. It's valuable, but it doesn't define us, I'm thankful for. But when I was at school, I ran a couple of businesses because I was an entrepreneur even in those days. And one of my little businesses was washing cars. And every Saturday morning, I would cycle around our neighbourhood with a bucket and a sponge and a chamois cloth, and I would wash cars. And some people's cars I washed every week. And I'd do half a dozen cars on a morning. It saved me getting up like the rest of the kids at school at some unearthly hour the rest of the week to do a paper round, which paid really badly. But anyway, the point is this, that one of the people whose cars I washed was called John. I can remember him saying to me one Saturday morning after I'd completed his car, and he gave me his £5. He said to me, Matt, he said, what are you going to do when you leave school? I said to him, John, I don't know. The next time I went to wash his car, and he gave me the £5 at the end, he gave me the application form for a job. He said, why don't you have a look at this? And it was to become an apprentice in the Ministry of Defence. And what I discovered was, not straight away, what I discovered was that John, whose car I washed every week, was a very senior civil servant in the Ministry of Defence. And so I filled out the application form, I went back. he helped me refill in the application form. I needed references. Guess who was first in the queue to give me a reference? I submitted the application form and I was called for interview. I was panicking. I was doing something else, but I can't say it on a Sunday morning in church. But John, after washing his car one week, he gave me his £5. He said, come in. And he sat me there and we practiced interview techniques. When I left school, I went to work for the Ministry of Defence. It was my first job, and it was thanks to John, who lent his credibility to me. In fact, it's my last job I've ever had. I'm actually now completely unemployable, thankfully. In case you don't get that, I do my own thing. Yeah. You get it. Thank you, Tunde. First job, last job. I remember one day, not far from here, sitting in a friend's office. And I was talking to him about a conference I was speaking at and what I was speaking on. And he said to me, Matt, you've got a book in you. I went, really? I just speak. I can't write. I was in remedial English at school. And he said, no, you've got a book in you. And he picked up his phone, dialed a number. He said, David, I've got a young man in my office here. He's got a book in him. Will you publish it, please? Oh, boo. David, yes, Matt, Bertie, yes, I have got a book in me. In those moments, I'd very quickly come up with a title for the book and a theme for the book and a breakdown of the chapters. That's why I published my first book. Because somebody practiced the trust transfer principle. They created a life opportunity for me by lending their credibility to me. That created the opportunity. I regularly now travel to West Africa. Why do I travel to West Africa? Who do I know in West Africa? But my friend, Pastor Ago Rukru, he knows one or two people in West Africa. And now I travel a couple of times a year and I do some work for some banks out there. That opportunity would never have come to me would it not be for somebody who created that life opportunity for me by lending their personal credibility to me to enable that to happen. Listen, I could stand here all morning and I could name any good thing that happens in my life and I can tell you the name of somebody who created that opportunity for me. In fact, I think I could pull any one of you up here and ask you to say, what are the three best things that have ever happened in your life? And if I asked you, who was the person who put their credibility on the line, who invited you, who took you, who introduced you, who paid for you, who enabled it to happen, you would be able to name a person who did that for you. And that is trust transfer. That is the trust transfer principle that Paul experienced when he came to Christ and the apostles in Jerusalem were very nervous about him for good reason. And Barnabas lent his credibility to Saul. And it's the same thing that happened when Paul went to Lystra and he listened to the believers who spoke well of Timothy. And so he took Timothy with him and he gave him an opportunity to join him on a missionary journey. Now, we're all so selfless as Christians, aren't we? And none of us are sat here thinking, wow, who here could help me out? Who could lend their credibility to me? Who would practice the trust transfer principle to help me out this week? Nobody's thinking that, are they? What I would say, of course we all are, but what I'd like to encourage you to do as a church, because we're countercultural, aren't we? What I'd like you to do in a moment is I want you to have a look around this room. You know, turn around your seat, look left, look right, just look behind you in case somebody's tucked themselves away. I want you to look around this room and I want you to have a look and see who this week you could practice the trust transfer principle with. Who here this week could you lend your credibility to create a life opportunity for? There may be somebody here who isn't in employment, who you could help into employment. There may be somebody here who just needs an odd job done to do this week to earn a bit of extra cash. There might be somebody here who's flying in their career, but actually you could help them fly even higher. There may be somebody here this week who is frankly struggling with family. Family is a beautiful and wonderful thing, but it creates lots of intense pressure. And sometimes you just need a bit of a break for an hour to go and get a coffee. Somebody to offer to babysit, not because they want some cash from you, just to say, go and have an evening out with your husband or wife and I'll babysit for you. It's a real resonation to that. There's some, you can guess from the laughter who would appreciate that. And have a look around this room and think about how you could help somebody else. How you could create a life opportunity for someone else in this room by lending your credibility to them. So just have a look around. See who you could help. Don't look at me. Oh, well, unless you think you can do something for me, that'd be great. But look around. Look at one another. Look at one another. What could you do for someone else? Who could you lend your credibility to create a life, family, or missionary opportunity for this week? I spend my time with a really diverse group of people. And once a year I go on a house party with a group of very wealthy people who feel burdened by their wealth. It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, just the millions they just rack up, and the interest, and it just keeps on. The blessing. And I go away with them once a year just to help them out. And you know what? No matter how much a person owns, that does not give them an ounce of meaning in life. And what they say to me, Matt, is meaning does not come by what you have. Meaning comes by what you give. Meaning is not found by what you accumulate and get in life and what you get others to give to you or pay you for. But actually, true meaning in life is found by what we give to others. Which reminds me of something that Jesus said. Whoever wants to follow me must be willing to pick up their cross every day. Whoever holds on to their life loses it, but whoever is willing to lose their life for my sake will find it. Because meaning in relationships is not found by what we get, but it's found by what we give. It's found by what we give. So this week, practice the trust transfer principle and discover more meaning, discover more significance. And as you pick up your Bible, iPad or in a printed book, remember, this book is not a book of doctrine. This book is a book of relationships. Do not read the Bible and draw from it religion of do's and don'ts and legalism. Pick up the Bible and read from it about God's continued reaching out through human history to have a relationship with humanity. Because more than anything else, God wants a love relationship with us. And so the lens. I went to the opticians recently because things were looking a little bit blurry. It was actually good news. My eyesight had got better, not worse. And they checked my eyes and they gave me a new prescription. I got some new glasses made up. Hope you like them. Thank you, Tunde. But the world looks differently now. You know, I can see you at the back. What are you doing? I can see you clearly. And sometimes we just need to change the prescription in our glasses so that when we read the Bible, it's fresh and new. And as you read about these amazing people and the relationship they had, you just see relationship with God. Reread any Bible character, any Bible passage through the lens of relationships, and you'll be inspired, and you will be lifted up, and you'll be resourced, and you will be empowered to live for him. Because the Bible is a book of relationships. I'm going to hand back to Tundi in a moment, but just to say I'm staying on, I understand, and at 12 o'clock, and I'd love to have a conversation with you. But if you've enjoyed what I've said this morning, I've got a book called Relationology full of secrets about relationships. And if you'd like a copy, I'll be signing them and selling them just through there somewhere afterwards. Thank you so much for listening.
Also, make sure you add us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit the church website.